Hello, my name is Lori Cohen. I'm the Director of Continuing Education at Gratz College. Thank you for joining us. Today, Dr. Paul Finkelman, President of Gratz College, will give us a fun and interesting look at a time when Jews were tough guys and gals. Our next webinar, which will take place in January, has not been scheduled yet. Stay close to your email for news about its date and topic. In fact, feel free to email me with ideas that you'd like to see for a future Gratz at Home presentation. I also invite you to join us on Sunday, December 6th at 7:00 p.m. for a free live streamed event to celebrate our 125th anniversary as the oldest Jewish college in North America. Philadelphia's own Jake Tapper, CNN anchor and chief Washington correspondent, will receive an honorary doctorate in humane letters and engage in a live discussion with Q&A on world events. Honorees Sora Landis, Lois, and the late Martin Bachman in Congregation Mikveh Israel will be recognized as recipients of the Gratz Medal. Also, Regina and the late Martin Horden will receive an honorary Master of Arts. More information about our anniversary celebration will be sent to your email after the presentation. And as I understand it, over 500 people have already signed up for this event. Please keep in mind, it will not be recorded, so don't miss it live. It's your one chance. I also want to mention that we will hold our biennial Arnold and Esther Tusman Memorial Holocaust Teach-In on March 7th. This will be an online event. We are delighted to announce that Art Spiegelman, the acclaimed illustrator of the graphic novel Mouse, will be our keynote speaker. Stay close to your email for more information about this program. But for now, please save the date of Sunday, March 7th. Lastly, I want to mention that the spring semester of continuing education classes has been posted and it's open for registration. Please look for a link in your email later tonight. If you have a question for today's program, please type it inside the chat function. I will moderate your questions at the end of the program. Right now, we are recording the session. I'll send you a link to the recording after it has been processed and edited. You will receive an online survey soon after the presentation ends. We appreciate your input as it helps us improve your experience for future webinars. We're in for a treat today. Dr. Finkelman has wanted to give this presentation about Jewish tough guys and gals since before our lives were interrupted in March. We've been thinking about it and working on it ever since. Most of you watching and listening right now know that Dr. Finkelman is a legal historian, author, professor, and baseball enthusiast, and that his work has been cited in several United States Supreme Court decisions. But today he'll be talking about something different. The fact that, contrary to popular belief, Jews were not always doctors and lawyers. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. And should we start the program?
I think we should.
Okay, so there's a story told at various events where when a young Jewish man turns 13 and has a bar mitzvah, that is when he discovers that he is more likely to own a baseball team than to play for one. And that, of course, is a comment on the nature of a modern American Jewish culture. Fortunately, nobody told that to Hank Greenberg or to Mo Berg, who played for Princeton and then played for a number of American and National League teams, and then was a member of the OSS, the spy organization during World War II. Nobody told Al Rosen, nobody told Sandy Koufax, nobody told Kevin Youkilis, and most recently, of course, nobody told Gabe Kapler, the player and then later manager of the Philadelphia Phillies. So when we think about when Jews were tough guys and tough gals, it's worth thinking about the way in which our notions of Jewish culture have changed over time. And if I'm just going to ask for slide 2 now. And so here's a kind of a montage of some of the people who are tough guys and tough gals. We have boxers, we have organized crime figures, we have two members of the Cartwright family on Bonanza, Lauren Green, the father of a group of tough cowboys. Well, he's actually a Jewish kid from Canada who moved to the United States. And of course, we have modern Jewish criminals going to jail. They're, I think, less tough guys, but just more embarrassments to the Jewish community. Let me have the next slide. So this is the Lower East Side. This is where more Jews congregated in the early part of the 20th century than any other place in the United States. Between 1870 and 1925, about 2.2 million Jews moved to the United States, mostly from Eastern Europe. All of my grandparents moved at that time, and members of their family as well. This Jewish immigration was massive, it was large. It was also incredibly impoverished. Indeed, in terms of how much money they had in their pockets, Jewish immigrants were poorer than any other identifiable group of immigrants. Italian immigrants from Sicily had more money in their pockets than Jews. Irish immigrants did. Polish immigrants did. Jews were the poorest. One of the reasons they were the poorest is because many of the people who left Europe had small parcels of land which they could sell. Jews in the Eastern European countries and provinces of Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and other places were not landowners, so they had no capital to raise as they moved to America. On the other hand, the Jewish immigrants had one very huge advantage. Almost all of the men and many of the women were literate. They were literate in Hebrew, they were literate in Yiddish, and sometimes they were literate in other languages, including German, Polish, Hungarian. And they were multilingual. And once you can learn two languages, it's easy to learn the third. So they were able to transform themselves into English speaking and, equally important, English reading and writing immigrants relatively quickly. Jews also came from a learning culture, as we know. Jews were called the people of the book. Now, on one hand, this meant simply that the Bible began with Jews, but on the other hand, the people of the book were people who thought books mattered, learning mattered, studying Talmud mattered. So it's a culture of schooling. Jews happened to come at precisely the moment when having some literacy and some culture of schooling was beneficial in coming to the United States. Furthermore, they were mostly urban. They came from small towns, medium-sized cities, and very large cities like Kiev or Warsaw. They moved to urban centers like New York. So they were familiar with urban life in the way that peasants from rural Poland or rural Russia or rural Italy were not. In addition, many Jews have some mechanical skills. Now, we take mechanical skills for granted today. Everybody knows how to drive a car. Everybody knows how to turn on a machine. But in the early 1900s, that was not necessarily the case. However, a significant number of Jews came from industries in Europe where they used sewing machines, where they used other machineries. And so they were again able to transform themselves into the United States economy to the changing work environment. There was also an advantage for Jewish women because in Europe, many Jewish women had participated with their husbands in small businesses, in running a shop, in buying and selling something. And this gave them an advantage over other immigrant women who did not come from such backgrounds. Finally, I think it's worth knowing that Jews didn't talk about going back home. Irish talked about returning to the old sod. More than half of the Italian immigrants who came to the United States went back to Italy. There was no place to go back to, and Jews didn't want to go back to. Instead, they came with a certain sense of political sophistication, of understanding that they had to make it in this new country and that they could make it in this new country. At the same time, as I started, they lived in these kinds of unbelievably crowded urban conditions, massive poverty, The Lower East Side was the most densely populated place in Europe or the United States at the time of World War I. It was a center of disease, particularly because it was so clogged, because people caught diseases quickly. Tuberculosis was rampant at various times. And poverty produces hardship, poverty produces hunger, and poverty produces tough guys and tough gals. So we'll start with a tough gal in the next picture, because we see here in the next slide, if it comes up.
Yes, Dr. Finkelman, I'd like to mention that we're getting a little interference from your mic. So just be aware of
See if I
that.
can move my mic. Is this better?
Well, let's give it a try and I'll let you know.
Okay, is this better?
It sounds good to me. Thank you.
Okay, so here we have Frederica Mandelbaum. And on my notes, I had Frederica Mandelbaum fencer. Now I'm going to talk about, or at least in passing, I'm going to mention some Jewish fencers later on, because some Jewish fencers have won Olympic medals. But she was a different kind of fencer. She fenced diamonds, she fenced jewelry, she fenced anything that anybody could steal. She was one of the first organized crime characters in early America. In addition to being a fencer, many other Jewish women engaged in prostitution. And in fact, this may come as a surprise to many people listening to this. In the early part of the 1900s, in New York City, in Philadelphia, yes, even in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Boston, prostitution was very much a Jewish business. And in fact, probably on a per capita basis, there are more Jews involved in prostitution than any other ethnic group. And they were involved from top to bottom. That is, some of them were prostitutes, earning living that way. Others were madams. There were Jewish males who were pimps. There were Jewish women who owned houses of prostitution. And in the Lower East Side, you could make a lot of money being a prostitute. A woman could make $10 to $15 a day working as a prostitute, which was more than her brother could work make in a textile factory working for an entire week. And indeed, a male wage earner in many jobs was making $6 to $8 a week. His sister could make that much or more in a single day. And so Jewish women flooded into this industry because it was an industry that was available to them. It was an industry where they could make money. And face it, it's an industry that does not have a lot of startup costs. In a 4-month period between November 1908 and March 1909, there were 2,093 prostitution cases in just the Lower East Side of New York. And the majority of them were Jewish women who were arrested. In one prison, there were 225 there were 580 foreign-born female prisoners. 225 of them were Jewish. 154 were French, 64 were German, 31 were Italian. The state reformatory for women in this period indicated that of the foreign-born people in the prison, 1/3 were Jewish. And this was a much higher rate than German, Irish, or other European ethnic groups. I don't know how to explain this phenomenon, although there are a number of possible explanations. One of them is that it was a business that was available. Another one is that these were the poorest immigrants, the people with the least amount of money. But it's also possible that for Jewish women, however, we might think this is not the optimal way to make a living, it was a way where someone could have some independence, where somebody could run her own small business as a prostitute. On the other hand, the organized Jewish community in New York City and elsewhere did their best to put a stop to this. New York City hired some social workers to study the problem and they interviewed people. And one of the interviews illustrates this issue. An interviewer was talking to a young preteen girl in her apartment, and they were overlooking another apartment across the alley where a prostitute was engaged in her profession with a gentleman. And the young girl said, "I'll go into that business when I grow up. It's a good business, easy, and you can dress well and eat well and live well." So that was one of the ways in which, in the early period, Jewish girls, Jewish women were tough gals. They were in a tough business, and they made it because it was the business that they had that they could make. And there were, of course, some very famous Jewish pimps in the Lower East Side. The most famous was a guy named Harry the Pimp, who had 20 girls working for him. He was happily married, but this was his business. But he was also a philanthropist. He gave to the community organizations. He gave food to the poor. He helped people out. It's a very different world than the world that we live in today. Many Jewish men were jailed for being pimps. And in 1908, the New York City police commissioner, who was notoriously anti-Semitic and a bigot, claimed that half of all the criminals in New York are Jewish. This is probably not true. This is an exaggeration. But it's possible that 20 to 25% of the criminals in New York at that time were Jewish. And so now if we go to the next slide, we see one of the very early Jewish pre-prohibition gangsters, a guy named Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein is known as the Brain. Arnold Rothstein was a gambler, and in 1919, he is the guy who fixed the World Series. The Chicago White Sox became known as the Chicago Black Sox because Arnold Rothstein hired people to pay off some of the White Sox players to throw the World Series. Ironically, Arnold Rothstein would be assassinated in 1928, rubbed out by other gangsters. Why? Because he failed to pay off on a bet that he owed somebody, and so he would be killed in 1928. But Arnold Rothstein helped transform organized crime. New York City was one of the centers of organized crime in the early part of the 1920s and into the 1930s. And one of the major figures is a guy named Bugsy Siegel, who we see in the next slide. And this is Bugsy Siegel on the right when he's a young, dapper man. And this is Bugsy Siegel who we see on the left of your screen after he is taken out in 1947. Bugsy got his name, his first name was Benjamin. Got his name Bugsy because they said he was crazy as a bug. He was a professional killer. He killed lots of people. And he learned a little bit from Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein, by the way, was considered the mentor to Lucky Luciano, to Meyer Lansky, to a guy named Arthur Flegenheimer, who, when he became a gangster, changed his name to Dutch Schultz. And we'll see a picture of Dutch Schultz in a minute. And to Jack Legs Diamond. These were gamblers. These were bootleggers. These were murderers. By the way, one more thing about Rothstein, and this is true for a lot of the Jewish criminals that we will see. He had a very complicated family. His father was considered a very, very upright, honest businessman. His father, Abe, was known as Abe the Just, and his brother became a rabbi. So after Bugsy Siegel, let's take a look at the next picture, and we see Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen, Meyer Harris, Mickey Cohen, a dapper man who eventually, after he partners with Bugsy Siegel, he moves out to California. He is a good friend of Frank Sinatra. He is a good friend of Richard Nixon. and he ends up living a relatively full life, dying at 63 in Los Angeles. He comes from an Orthodox family, and he's a very successful criminal. The next picture, if we can get it, on the next slide, is Dutch Schultz, Arthur Flingenheimer. And Dutch Schultz, of course, is a gangster, a killer, a murderer, and he dies practicing his profession. Note the ages of these people. Dutch Schultz lives only 33 years old. The lifespan of a professional criminal is not very long in this period of time. Our next picture, we get two more guys, Harry Horowitz and Lefty Louis Rosenberg. You can see on the right the wanted poster for Harry Horowitz. He is an early Jewish gangster. And on the bottom, on the left side at the bottom, you see Harry Horowitz and Lefty Louis Rosenberg, wanted for murder. They're an example of literally a couple of hundred people like this. I could have one picture after another of these people. Harry Horowitz is known as Gip the Blood, and they're gunmen. They're killers. A guy who is not a killer is our next picture. He's a tough guy, but he doesn't kill anybody. This is Meyer Sokolansky, better known as Meyer Lansky. And Meyer Lansky, of course, lives to be 81 years old. He is the accountant for the mob. He runs money. Meyer doesn't do any killing himself. He pays for it. He counts the money that's made from the killings. And he is a very successful guy who somehow manages to not annoy or anger the people who pull triggers, although there are a couple of attempts on his life. Our next slide, and this is just sort of a montage I want to give you. Albert Ali Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, another guy who lives to be pretty old, and Perry Millick, and William Blackie Zakowski, and Dr. Morris Bulber. Dr. Morris Bulber ended his days in a lifetime sentence in Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. He was also known as Louis the Rabbi. His specialty was poisoning people. I guess he used his medical knowledge to practice a different kind of art. The next picture, if we can have it, is one of my favorite Jewish gangsters. Not because he's particularly important, because he's not because he's particularly famous, but because he was a pious man. Samuel Red Levine worked for an organization called Murder Incorporated. Murder Incorporated, by the way, was an entirely Jewish operation in New York City. And Red Levine was a hitman for Murder Incorporated. He died in Sing Sing. The date on the of his death, 1972, I think is wrong, but unfortunately I can't give you the right death date. But what makes Red Levine interesting is if he had a contract on your life and he didn't kill you by Friday afternoon, you were safe until Sunday, because Sam Red Levine didn't work on Shabbat, so he wouldn't kill you on the Sabbath. He remembered one of those 10 commandments, to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. He forgot the part about not murdering people. And in fact, he ended up in life sentence in jail. The next picture, our next slide, is the Purple Gang. The Purple Gang is the most murderous gang in America. The Purple Gang, the founder of the Purple Gang was Abe Bernstein, along with his brother Joe Bernstein and Raymond Bernstein, and their friend Julius Horowitz. The Purple Gang ran Detroit. They were mostly involved in smuggling liquor in from Canada. Of course, Detroit is right across a river from Canada, so it was easy to bring liquor into the United States from Canada. And the Purple Gang did an awful lot of importing liquor, but they also did an awful lot of killing. It is estimated that at least 500 people were murdered by the Purple Gang in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. In 1931, there was a peace conference between the Bernsteins, leading the Purple Gang, and a group of other Jewish criminals. The Bernsteins came to the peace conference and they immediately killed Jaime Paul, Isidore Sutkin, and Joe Leibovitz, who were the other gangsters that they were supposed to have a peace conference with. They were 3 members of the Purple Gang were convicted for these murders: Irving Milberg, Harry Caswell, and Raymond Bernstein. The Purple Gang was also accused of kidnapping Charles Lindbergh's child. So that's the Purple Gang. Actually, let's wait up for a second on this picture. And the only probably organized crime group that matched them would have been Murder Incorporated, which was run in part by Martin Goldstein and had Abe Kid Twist Rellis, Harry Pittsburgh Strauss, and they allegedly were involved in 1,000 assassinations, but over a much longer time than the Purple Gang. So now I want to switch to a different kind of tough guys, because while crime was always an aspect of poverty and ghetto life, and we'll come back to some criminals in a little while because they merge in some ways. The other way of making it in a tough world was sports. And sports becomes very important for Jewish immigrant kids. So if we can turn to the next page, what we know is that to be a successful athlete, to be a professional athlete, to be a star in athletics, you have to be willing to work very, very hard. You have to be willing to absorb an enormous amount of pain and suffering, because that's what it takes to be a successful athlete. Early on, Jews are involved in athletics because it is a way out of the US ghettos. Now, Jews were not required to be in ghettos the way they were in some parts of Europe, but nevertheless, they lived in what were clearly ghettos. So Meyer Prinstein is a guy who runs out of the ghetto, or runs and jumps out of the ghetto. In 1900, he wins 1 gold and 1 silver medal in the Olympics. And in 1904, he wins 2 gold medals. That same year, Samuel Berger wins a gold medal in boxing. And I'll talk a lot about boxing in a little while. And so the Jews, the poor Jews of America, begin to find their way into organized sports. Now, Jews are underrepresented in terms of their desire to be in the Olympics, because the Olympics is often run by people who are not sympathetic to having too many Jews running on their teams. And by the way, African Americans, of course, face the same problem up through the 1970s and 80s, when it becomes clear that you shouldn't discriminate in that way. But Jews begin to win gold medals in the Olympics over and over again, starting with this small group of Jews in 1904, in 1900, and then 1904. By the way, in 1900, there is also a more famous name of a Jew who wins an Olympic gold medal, and that is Baron Edward Rothschild, who, of course, will ultimately be the owner of the famous vineyard Lafitte Rothschild. He wins a gold medal in polo. But there are Jewish Americans who win medals in 1908. But by the way, in 1908, 1 Jewish American wins a bronze medal in track, another wins a silver medal in shooting. But 15 other Jews from Hungary, France, Great Britain, Austria, and Denmark are also winning medals. And of course, in many ways, these European Jews are very much like their American Jewish counterparts. They are poor, they are urban. This is a way out of their urban communities. In 1912, 2 Jewish track team members win silver medals. 18 other Jews win medals from Europe. In 1920, Sam Mosberg wins a gold medal in boxing. Mo Herkowitz wins a bronze medal in boxing. And Jews win 2 medals, silver medals in wrestling. These are all on the American team. So when one thinks of the Jewish immigrant as weak or afraid to be physical. And this was a rumor. This was a constant anti-Semitic canard. The great anti-Semitic of the age, Henry Ford, waxed eloquently and, of course, incorrectly that Jews could not be good athletes because they had weak bodies and they weren't tough enough. But so here we have in 1920, Jews winning medals in boxing and wrestling. In 1924, Jackie Fields wins a gold medal in boxing, and 2 other Jews win medals. In 1920, and if we can go to the next picture here, the next slide. This is the Dutch gymnast team from 1928. 4 of the members of this team are Jewish, who win gold medals, as well as the coach, who is Jewish. So here we have a U.S. Here we have a European Olympics team where Jews are the stars and the coach. That same Olympic, 2 U.S. boxers win medals. And if I can get the next picture up, in 1928. Oh, wait, okay, this is the wrong picture. There we are, Lillian Copeland. And in that same year, Lillian Copeland becomes the first American Jewish woman to win a medal in the Olympics. She wins a silver in track in 1928. She comes back and wins the gold medal in 1932. Notice what she does. She's a discus thrower, a shot putter, and a javelin thrower. These are tough Jews. The most famous Olympics in the era, of course, are the 1936 Olympics. And the 1936 Olympics are in Berlin. They are the Nazi Olympics. There are 2 Jews who are track stars, Glickman and Stroller. Both of them are expected to be in the 4x400 meter relay because they are on the team that gets to the finals. But in the finals, they're pulled because Hitler makes it very clear to the Americans that he does not want to see 2 Jewish track stars getting gold medals. And so they are pulled from the team. The team still wins the gold medal, but without their 2 stars. There is 1 Jewish player on the gold medal basketball team. Weirdly enough, there is also a Jew on the German team who wins a medal in the 1936 Olympics. How this 1 Jewish athlete managed to be on Hitler's Olympic team, I don't know. It would be another story to tell and find out. So this is the story of when Jews were tough guys in the Olympics. It didn't stop with the 1930s and 1940s. So if I can get the next picture up, this is Eichberger, Isaac Eichberger, who is a 3-time Jewish medal winner in weightlifting, 1956, 1960, and 64. Now, what's interesting about Eichberger is that he lifts weights for the United States. He's on the U.S. Olympic team, but he is actually born in British Palestine, and he emigrates to the United States later. So he's not only the first U.S. medal winner, but in some kind of weird way, he might also be the first Israeli medal winner. The next person I want to show you is Agnes Kelty. Agnes Kelty was a hidden child in Hungary during the war. She had Catholic papers and worked as a maid on somebody's farm during the war. She remained in Hungary, and she would win 10 Olympic medals, 5 golds and 5 silvers as a gymnast in 1952 and 1956. After 1956, she would move to Israel for a while, take Israeli citizenship, and then return to Hungary, where, as far as I know, at age 99, she is still alive. And this is obviously a relatively recent picture of her holding her silver and gold medals. I want to introduce you to just a couple of more modern people. So the next slide is Dara Torres. Dara Torres is from California. Dara Torres has won 12 swimming medals, 5 gold, 4 silver, 4 bronze. She has appeared in 5 Olympic Games and won medals in all of them. In 2008, at age 41, she won a silver medal in swimming, which makes her the oldest Olympic swimmer to ever win a medal. And it was only after age 41 that she decided it was fully time to retire from the Olympics. I want to switch now to the great American sport for just a minute, or the 2 great American sports. So if I can get the next slide, we get to basketball, which of course was invented in the United States. And it always surprises people when they discover that in the 1930s and 1940s and into the 1950s, basketball was very much of a Jewish game. Red Holtzman was a star player before, of course, he became a star coach. If we can go to the next slide, we get the Jewish father and son team, Dolph Shays, who played in Philadelphia, and his son, Danny Shays, who played for the Milwaukee Bucks, as you can see. Dolph Shays originally played for the Syracuse Nationals, and Danny, I have to, put all the cards on the table. I'm a Syracuse alum, so, I bleed a little bit of orange. Danny Shays played for Syracuse before going pro. I once gave a talk at Temple Concord in Syracuse, which is the 5th oldest Reformed Jewish congregation in the United States. It's just a year or 2 older than congregation Knesset Israel, which is right down the road from Gratz. And I was being shown around the synagogue, and they have this wonderful lounge, which the rabbi was showing me, and it was completely refurbished. It was like the nicest room in the building. And he said that this lounge was refurbished by Dolph Shays, who after he retired moved back to Syracuse. But he insisted that the name on the lounge indicate his gift, and so it is called the Shays Lounge, which shows that he's not only a great basketball player, but a guy with a sense of humor. The next picture is both a picture of tragedy and success in Jewish basketball. The 1950 City College basketball team is the only basketball team in American history to win both the NIT championship and the NCAA championship in the same year. It has an overwhelming number of Jewish players. It has a Jewish coach. You can see on the right picture that there are a couple of black players, and almost everybody else is not black, and most of those players are Jewish. And it is a great basketball team. And then, of course, in 1951, this team is connected to the greatest scandal in college sports, the point shaving scandal, and a number of the players on this team are charged with shaving points. And the tragedy of that basketball team is still sort of an embarrassment in American Jewish culture. So that's basketball. By the way, I think it's worth noting, just before I go to baseball, that in the most recent NBA draft, it was either the number 7 or 8 player drafted in this year's NBA draft, played for Tel Aviv Maccabi. And so he is an Israeli who was drafted seven. I think it's either seventh or eighth to play in the NBA next year. So now I want to turn to baseball, the great American sport. Here are baseball cards for some of the great American Jewish baseball players. Mo Berg is interesting because Mo Berg is not a great player. Mo Berg is a guy who managed to stick around for a pretty long career, but he was never a star, although he played on a lot of different teams. And what's interesting about Mo Berg is that when he wasn't catching for various teams, he was going to law school, and he earned a law degree at Columbia Law School while he was playing professional baseball. He was also famous for, he spoke about 7 or 8 languages, and he was the third string catcher. So he'd be out in the bullpen ready to warm up pitches if needed be. But if he wasn't warming up pitchers, he was often studying some new foreign language or reading some book of philosophy. He was, one of the great intellectuals of baseball. And as I mentioned earlier, during World War II, Mo Berg goes into work for the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner of the CIA. And he is tasked with going to Switzerland to assassinate the German Nobel Prize winning physicist Heisenberg. And he meets with Heisenberg because Americans know that the Nazis are trying to build an atomic bomb, and Heisenberg is the genius behind the atomic bomb. And Mo Berg is prepared to assassinate Heisenberg if he thinks that Heisenberg is going to build the bomb. And after talking to Heisenberg for a long time, Mo Berg, of course, is pretending to be from another country because he speaks so many languages, he can fake it. He gets along very well with Heisenberg. And he later concludes and goes back to the OSS and says, there's nothing to worry about. Heisenberg has no idea what he's doing. And so he doesn't assassinate Heisenberg. The guy in the middle, Hank Greenberg, what can we say? He is a New York City kid. He wanted to play for the Yankees, but he was a first baseman, and the Yankees already had a pretty good first baseman, Lou Gehrig. So instead, Hank Greenberg went and played for the Detroit Tigers. One year when the Tigers are in the thick of a pennant race, and they really need Greenberg because he is their best hitter. He, by the way, hits 58 home runs one year, just too short of what was then Babe Ruth's record of 60 home runs. So hammering Hank Greenberg, the Hebrew Hammer, as he's also called, has the great dilemma. Do I play on Rosh Hashanah? Because we need to win this game to win the pennant. And his rabbi tells him it's okay to play on Rosh Hashanah because Rosh Hashanah is a happy day, it's a festival. And so it's okay for him to play on Rosh Hashanah, and he does, and he hits 2 home runs to win the game. He does not, however, play a regular season game on Yom Kippur that year, and the Tigers still win and go to the World Series. And not playing in that game on Yom Kippur, of course, is what leads Sandy Koufax to refuse to play on Yom Kippur when it is the opening day of the World Series. And instead, the Dodgers put in their second best pitcher, John Drysdale, who's a spectacularly good pitcher. And Drysdale has a terrible day and he loses. And allegedly, when Drysdale is pulled out in the middle of the game with the Dodgers losing, he allegedly says to his coach, Walt Alston, that I bet you wish I was Jewish too. Because then he wouldn't have pitched and lost the game. If we get to the next picture, by the way, somebody asked me about Red Auerbach. There was a question that popped up. Red Auerbach is, of course, one of many famous Jewish basketball players who, of course, later becomes the coach and then the owner of the Boston Celtics. Basketball is a phenomenally Jewish game in the 1930s, 40s, and into the 50s, and continues a little bit today. So if we can go to the next slide, here's again just a montage. We have Al Rosen, who was a player and then later a manager for the Cleveland Indians. We have the Sherry brothers, one of whom is a pitcher and one of whom is a catcher for the Dodgers. Kevin Youkilis, who is known as the Greek god, because everybody thinks Euclid is Greek, but in fact he's Jewish. And of course, we have Gabe Kepler, who eventually came and managed for the Philadelphia Phillies. These are just some of the many Jewish baseball players. I want to mention football just briefly. So if I can get the next slide. And what we see in football is some modern players like Julian Edelman and Joshua Ballinger. And we have a guy named William Goldberg who played football for a while. But then when he left professional football, he became a wrestler and he was simply known as Goldberg. Goldberg is from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I taught for a number of years. And he was a member of the temple that I was a member of. And my rabbi said that he was once at a conference and somebody gave some back talk to my rabbi, and another rabbi leaned over and he said, "You better watch out. Goldberg is in his temple. Don't mess with him." So Goldberg was tough. But the one of the great Jewish football stars was Sid Luckman, who played for the Chicago Bears. And in the 30s and 40s, there were a fair number of important Jewish football stars playing in both colleges and in professional football. The quarterback for the University of Michigan for 2 years was a Jewish player who set all sorts of records. And now I want to turn to what is truly the Jewish sport of the first half of the 20th century, and that is boxing. And I'm going to start with Benny Leonard. Born Benjamin Lanier, he changes his name to Benny Leonard because he doesn't want his parents to know that he is a boxer, because that would upset his parents. Benny Leonard is considered in every website, if you go to 50 greatest boxers, 25 greatest boxers, Benny Leonard is the greatest lightweight in boxing history. He is a phenomenal boxer. He holds the championship for many, many years. And he's a dominant boxer. He ultimately retires undefeated. And then sadly, like so many boxers, he comes back and fights again and sort of ends in not having such a great career. Boxing had actually been a Jewish sport for longer than we would imagine. In 1787, an English boxer named Daniel Mendoza, who is a Jew, a Sephardic Jewish background, is the leading boxer in England at the time that the United States is writing the Constitution. And he is the author of the first book on boxing called The Art of Boxing. In the 18th century, Daniel Mendoza was kind of like the Sandy Koufax of London. He was a great Jewish hero because he was the champion in England for a long time. Now, when you look at Jewish boxers, you run into all kinds of funny things. So the next picture is a guy named Lech Cross. Dr. Lech Cross, known as the fighting dentist. He was born Lewis Wallach, but he's afraid to go as Lewis Wallach because people will know that Wallach is a Jewish name. So he changes his name to the most Christian name he can think of. He becomes Lech Cross, fights under that name. But later, like any good Jewish son, he becomes a dentist. He didn't have time to become a doctor. So he becomes the fighting dentist. He's just one of many, many Jewish boxing stars. The list goes on and on. I'm just going to run a bunch of names by you because it's just one name after another. So Abe Attell, who's known as the Little Hebrew, is a featherweight world champion. Jackie Fields wins a gold medal. I've mentioned Benny Leonard. I'm going to talk in a little while about Barney Ross. There's a guy named Izzy Schwartz, Bob Olin, Newsboy Brown, Benny Bass, Chrysanthemum Joe, Choinsky, Abe Chung. Abe Chung is really interesting. I'm sorry, Ah Chung. A-H, Ah Chung is really interesting. Ah Chung's real name is Rosenberg, but he puts makeup on and pretends to be Chinese because he thinks if he's a Chinese boxer, people will come to watch him box. And he gets away with this for a while until some guy who actually is Chinese tries to talk to him after a match in Chinese, which of course Rosenberg doesn't know. Abi Bain, Ruby Goldstein, Jaime Cantor, Sammy Dorfman. The names go on and on and on of famous Jewish boxers. I'm going to skip over the next picture and go to the following picture. So this is Corporal Isidore Schwartz. He's a corporal in World War I, and after World War I, he comes back to become a boxing star. He is a flyweight, and he manages to win the crown by beating the next person we're going to look at, who is in the next picture, is Newsboy Brown. Born David Montrose, he changes his name to Newsboy Brown. Why is he called Newsboy? Because as a kid, he sells newspapers, and newspaper kids often had a fight for turf and fight with each other, so he became a boxer. So Newsboy Brown becomes the flyweight champion until he's beaten by Corporal Izzy Schwartz. There are, in fact, a significant number of world championship fights between one boxer and another boxer. Another colorful character here is our next picture. And this is advertising a fight with Battling Levinsky. And again, notice the bottom fight is between Gottwald and Wolpert. This is common in the 1920s and 30s. The next guy who we're going to look at is more important. This is Barney Ross. Dove Bear Beryl David Rosofsky, who changed his name to Barney Ross. Barney Ross grows up in the toughest neighborhood in Chicago, Maxwell Street. It is a impoverished neighborhood. His father is a Talmud scholar, but of course he can't make a living as a Talmud scholar, so instead he runs a grocery store. Barney is a tough kid. He's always getting into fights, and he's also a little bit of a gangster. He's arrested when he's quite young. And he grows up, by the way, one of his friends who he grows up with, I told you I'd be getting back to crime after a while. So one of the guys he grows up with is a guy named Jacob Sparky Rubenstein. And Jacob Rubenstein will later change his last name to Ruby and his first name to Jack. And of course, Jack Ruby is a small-time criminal in Chicago who becomes a small-time criminal in Dallas until he assassinates Lee Harvey Oswald after Oswald had assassinated President Kennedy. So Ross comes from a tough neighborhood, but ultimately he ends up in boxing. At first, he tries to hang out in organized crime. There are a number of local gangsters, all of whom work in some way or other for Al Capone, a guy named Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, who actually takes over for Capone when Capone goes to jail, Samuel Nails Morton, Louis Two Gun Altieri. All of these are Jewish guys from Maxwell Street. Ross becomes a runner for the mob, and he meets Al Capone, and he tells Al Capone, "I want to work for you." And whatever else we know about Al Capone is apparently a relatively good judge of character when he meets people. He talks to Barney Ross for a while. He slaps him on the back. He gives him some money. And he basically says, "Kid, you're not cut out to be a killer. You're cut out to be a boxer." And instead, Al Capone pays the fees for him to go to boxing school and learn how to box. And so Barney Ross becomes a boxer. In 1933, he wins the light heavyweight championship and the junior welterweight championship at the same time because he defeats somebody, Tony Canizzari, who actually holds both crowns at once. So he's suddenly both the lightweight champion and the junior welterweight champion. And later he also wins the full welterweight champion. He gains a little weight and wins the full welterweight champion. So he's one of the very few boxers who's held 3 boxing crowns. He is always loosely associated with organized crime figures. Organized crime figures are betting on him, supporting him. He retires from boxing, gets married, puts on a little weight, gets out of shape, and then World War I begins. And at age 34, he insists on going into the Marines. The Marines don't want to take him because he's too old. He petitions, he gets in, and he ends up winning a Silver Star and being brutally wounded at the battle at Guadalcanal. He unfortunately gets malaria as well as is being terribly wounded, and ends up for a number of years being addicted to morphine, the painkiller of World War II. He eventually comes back from that and lives out his life as somebody who had overcome poverty, overcome many things. And he is a Jewish sports hero of the 30s. The next guy I want to show you is Al Davis, who is Brownsville's belting beauty. Brownsville, of course, is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. Notice what's on his shorts. He is one of a number of star fighters who fight with the Mogan David on their shorts in the late 1930s when he's pretty young. Here we have the next picture is 4 Jews who are wearing Mogan Davids. Schooled by Bernie Friedkin, who I believe is from Philadelphia. Lefty Lou Tendler, who's also from Philadelphia. Ruby Goldstein, who's known as the Jewel of the Ghetto, and Jack Bernstein. Jack Bernstein is kind of interesting because his birth name was John Dodick, which is not a particularly obviously Jewish name, but when he comes back from World War I to become a boxer, he changes his name to Bernstein. He wins the junior lightweight world championship and then spends the rest of his life in suburban New York. And he's very much involved in the Jewish War Veterans organizations at the end of his life. The next slide is the only Jewish full heavyweight champion of the world, Max Baer. And next to him is his son, Max Baer Jr., who, of course, is on the Beverly Hillbillies. Max Baer is 6'4". He is huge. He is famous for an unbelievably powerful right-handed punch. He kills one boxer during a fight, and he is blamed for killing another one. The boxer actually didn't die when fighting Baer, but dies in his next bout. But everybody says he dies because he never recovered from being punched by Max Baer. Max Baer doesn't initially wear a Jewish star on his shorts, but he wears it on his shorts for the first time when he fights against Max Schmeling in 1933. This is right after Hitler has taken over Germany. Max Schmeling is the German champion. Max Schmeling kind of gets a bum rap. He's talked about as Hitler's boxer. Schmeling hated the Nazis. On Kristallnacht, he hid some Jews in his house to prevent them from being beaten up or killed. He is ultimately denounced by Hitler, and only the fact that he was a boxing hero probably prevented him from getting sent to a concentration camp. But in 1933, before the Holocaust, before all of this, he is the German boxer, and the fight in Yankee Stadium is filled with American Jews and German American Jews. 60,000 seats are sold, and Baer comes out in the ring with a Star of David on his shorts, and he wins a TKO in the 10th round. He actually asks the referee to stop the fight. He says, please stop this fight. I don't want to kill somebody else in the ring. He's afraid he's going to kill Schmeling because Schmeling is standing but is completely punch drunk. He then, the following year, fights the heavyweight champion of the world, Primo Canera, who is, of course, Italian. And so Max Baer, wearing the Star of David, defeats the boxing champion from the two fascist countries that the United States will face in World War II, Italy and Germany. Unfortunately for Max Baer, he wasn't all that hardworking as an athlete. He doesn't like to train. He'd much rather party. And in 1935, he has a stunning loss to Jim Braddock, and he loses his championship, and he ceases to be a successful boxer. I want to give you one more successful boxer in this period. The light heavyweight champion of the world is in the next slide. And this is Maxie Rosenblum, better known as Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum. Everything you read about Maxie Rosenblum is that it isn't so much as he's a great slugger, although he is because he becomes the light heavyweight champion of the world, but it is that he is so good at avoiding getting hit. Nobody can seem to lay a glove on him. He manages to keep his pretty face. He doesn't get punched out. He wins the light heavyweight championship of the world. And then he goes off to Hollywood, where he has a career as Slapsy Maxie, the actor. And after Max Baer retires, Max Baer also goes out to Hollywood. Max Baer appears in 20 movies. Boxers are movie stars in these days because there's if they're not too punched out, they're these handsome creatures. And so Max Baer is in 20 movies. And then he forms a comedy team with Maxie Rosenblum, and they're known as the Two Maxies, and they go on tour as a comedy team. So I could go on for a very long time about Jewish boxers, and I don't want to, but I do want to make one point, which I think is interesting. In preparing for this, I went through all sorts of research, and one of the places I went is to the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. So in the course of 20th century boxing, American Jews hold 24 world titles. Two non-American Jews also hold world titles. So there are 24 world titles by American Jewish boxers. They hold every single weight class at one point or another. At one point, in fact, from 1910 to 1939, with the exception of 1913, there is at least one world title holder every year who's an American Jew. There are 3 world title holders in 1 year. I'm sorry, in 7 different years, there are 3 world title holders, 1930, 32, 33, 34, and 35. In 1933, there are 4 world title holders, and there are 9 championship fights between 1920 and 1934, where both the defending world champion and the challenger are Jews. But here's what I want to point out, because I find this fascinating. In the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame, and I looked a year ago, maybe it's changed a little, but I doubt it, there are 6 Jewish boxers. I would think that every single Jewish boxer who held a world title would be in the American Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. There are only 6. There are 29 basketball players, there are 15 baseball players, and there are 21 football players. I suspect this suggests the prejudices of the people who run the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. They're not quite up to accepting the fact that one Jew after another made his living punching people out. And of course, this circles me back to where I began. If you grow up poor, if you grow up in a tough neighborhood, if you grow up in a ghetto, getting hit in the face becomes a reasonably serious way to make a living, and lots of people are willing to do it. People are willing to fight to make a living because it's the best way they can make a living. There are some other tough Jews, and I want to just show a few of them quickly. So here is one. If I could have the next slide. You don't get any tougher than Spartacus, the Jewish actor Kirk Douglas. And in the next picture, we get a couple of Jewish cowboys, Michael Landon and Lauren Green of Bonanza fame. And finally, I want to show some Jews who I don't think are very tough. They can't even claim that they are tough guys. They're just criminals, and it's sad. So if I could have the last set of slides, we have Bernie Madoff, and the next slide we get Harvey Weinstein, and the next slide we get Jeffrey Epstein, and finally we end up with perhaps the most pathetic one of them all. One of these people is a criminal, a Jewish criminal. And so this tells us something about the nature of the Jewish world today. Today, it might be true that Jews are less likely to play basketball. Somebody texted me saying that they think that Dan Blocker is Jewish. From Bonanza, I do not think so. I've researched this. He grew up in Texas. He went to a Christian college, and I don't think Dan Blocker was Jewish. But if I am wrong, I would love to be able, next time I do this, to add Dan Blocker to my list of Jewish tough guys. So let's go back to the first slide so we don't have to look at Michael Cohen. And of course, this, by the way, is a montage of 3 Jewish gangsters. I'm happy to take questions. What's the process here? Laura, are you coming back on?
I'm right back here. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Finkelman. This has been a really fun presentation. I'm learning that our Jewish history contains some really inspiring and also some pretty nefarious characters. So thank you.
I would also add a certain level of pathos. That is that one doesn't look, for example, at the Jewish women who were in the prostitution world as either nefarious or admirable. They were simply poor people who made a living in the only way they knew how to make a living. And that's part of this too. And some of these boxers are the same way. They don't really want to get punched out. They just like eating a lot. But anyways, I'd love to take questions.
You have a lot of great questions. Before we jump into them, I just wanted to mention we've got a lot of great folks on the webinar tonight, and we have a lot of adult continuing education students. We've got some alumni and current students and Gratz staff and faculty also. And of course, if anyone would like to help make it possible for us to support even more students across the world, please consider a tax-deductible charitable donation. So thank you to everyone so far. And so, Paul, the questions that we have for you coming up.
But by the way, before I go any further, I have to welcome my cousin Roy, who's on the list. And he is from suburban Philadelphia. He lives in Delaware, the home state of Joe Biden. So it's nice to have some family out there. And also my cousin Edna, who is from California. I'm just looking over the list who are showing up. So it's nice to have family members. I'm actually always surprised that anybody in my family would actually voluntarily hear me mouth off, but it's nice.
Great. Great. Well, it's good to know we've got support all over the place. That was your version of the hi, mom.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we have a lot of people who've just mentioned other folks who are Jewish, but there was one question that really a specific question that I wanted to get to that was about the Jewish crime, and that was, can you talk for a minute about the garment industry?
Sure. So the garment industry is a very Jewish industry in Europe. At the time of the Great Migration to America, the city of Łódź, which is spelled L-O-D-Z, but pronounced Łódź in Poland, is a giant textile city with huge textile factories owned by Jews, and most of the people who work in them are Jews. And of course, many of the people who come to America come and end up in the textile factory because they come from a background, as I said earlier, where they understand how sewing machines work. I got to tell you, my grandfather on my father's side was a cap maker. He made men's caps. My grandfather on my mother's side was ran a sewing machine until he became the manager of a cloth making factory. And my grandmother on my father's side worked in the ladies' garment industry. And again, so three out of my four grandparents were in the needle trades, as it was called. And like many industries, there was a fair amount of rough stuff in the needle trades, and there was a fair amount of corruption. But I think, and again, I'm no expert on this, so I would have to come back with tough guys and gals part two and look at the needle trades. But my sense is that the garment industry isn't where the big money is. And so the crime there are people roughing other people up, beating people up. There is some of that. It goes on all the time. And this is part of 19th century and early 20th century urban America. It's not a pretty picture.
That's good to know. I know the question was from someone who had read the book, The Button Man, which I heard was a pretty good book. And that does talk a lot about the crime in the garment industry. So that's where the question came from. I was just going to add, I don't know if this is supposed to be a joke. I think it is. Any tough chess players out there? How about Bobby Fischer?
Well, there are, to the extent that chess is a sport, yeah, Bobby Fischer and many other Jewish chess players who become, serious professional chess players, including one of the very few women who became an international grandmaster who was Jewish. I think at the level of professional chess, it's a sport because what it requires is an unbelievable amount of physical stamina to sit there for that long and concentrate that hard without your muscles tightening up and freezing. So in that sense, it's a sport. And Bobby Fischer is one, and there are others.
Agreed. There are a couple of other questions.
But they're not tough guys in the way that Goldberg, the wrestler, is a tough guy.
Not in the same way. Tough in a different way, for sure. I see also a question. Was the boxer Al Davis the same person as the Oakland Raiders owner?
No, I think I do not believe so. But I would have to check on that. And I'm pretty sure the boxer Al Davis, that was, of course, was not his original name, but I would have to check on that.
Gotcha. Did Murder Incorporated finance Las Vegas?
Murder Incorporated is involved in the creation of Las Vegas. The New York mob is involved in it. And in fact, Bugsy Siegel is sent from New York to help create the criminal element of Las Vegas. And it's in Las Vegas that Bugsy Siegel becomes too big for his own britches in mob category. And so we end up with the picture of him being shot a number of times, sitting on his couch. But yes, and Jews go out to help make Las Vegas what it is.
Great. I'm just gonna read it. There are several people just asked in general, just kind of get commented in general. And one person says that Hedy Lamarr was an Austrian Jewess who was one of the great beauties of the screen and the inventor of mechanisms to disrupt torpedo guidance. So
yes,
would you say she's one of the tough Jews?
Well, I don't think that's tough. I think that's just smart and talented. I mean, part of the impetus for doing this is because there is a sense within America that that some ethnic groups make great athletes and some ethnic groups make great doctors and dentists, and the two can't meet. And what I would argue is that if we could get a sampling of any group of people, however you want to define it, whether it's their continent of origin, whether it's their culture, whether it's their country, whether it's their religion, whether it's what we call race, color, whatever it is. If you had a sampling of 50 different groups of people, you would probably find pretty much the same amount of athletic skill among all of them. That is, some people are born with athletic skill and some people are not. I remember going to a baseball game for what's called the instructional league. And the instructional league are kids who just got out of high school and they've kind of been drafted, but they're not ready even to play, single A baseball. And watching instructional league kids, they're 17, 18 years old. You see them do incredibly stupid, dumb things because they don't know any better. And if you really understand the sport, you say, how could this guy do this? And then you see them do something that in a million years I could never do, or most people could never do, because when they were born, somebody dropped fairy dust on them and they got those genes. Now, so the question is not whether you get those genes. The question is, what do you do with them? And that's where culture comes in. That's where family decisions are made. That's where you get a change in attitude. So when you read about many of these Jewish boxers, for example, almost all of them, their parents don't want them to be boxers. Barney Ross's father is like, become a rabbi. I'm a Talmud scholar, but unfortunately I have to run a grocery store. You should become a rabbi. You're smart enough to become a rabbi. And he doesn't want him to be a boxer. A number of the Jewish boxers change their names because they don't want to. They don't want to be known as. They don't want their parents to know who they are. So they take on different names, slightly different names, so their parents won't hear that their kid is actually being a boxer. Benny Leonard, for example, is not born as Benny Leonard. He takes that name because he doesn't want his parents to know that he's boxing. So that's culture. But what's very clear is the culture of Jewish immigrants is a tough culture. And again, when you read these biographies, it's often, his mother cried when he became a boxer until he brought $20 home from winning. And then she said, when's your next match? Which suggests that the culture is still about making it in America. And so sports and crime, particularly, and to some extent movies and theater, have always been a way of making it when you don't have a leg up in any other way. So Jews go into a number of businesses in the 19 teens and 20s that are not considered to be really businesses that you want to brag about. Junkyards. I grew up in a town in the middle of nowhere, 100 Jewish families. There are 2 junkyards in town. Both of them are owned by Jews. Well, why are Jews in the junkyard business? Because it's a business nobody else wants to go into, but it's a business where if you're hardworking and you're reasonably smart and you've brought with you as an immigrant the ability to read and write and what's known as numeracy, the ability to manipulate numbers, it's easy to go into the junkyard business. Lots of Jews become auto dealers, car mechanics, because it's a new industry and there's nobody there to prevent them from going into the business. So my car says you're following another Goldstein Subaru, and the great Cadillac dealer in New York is Potemkin, and right up the street from Gratz is a Sussman dealership and a Glansman dealership. So Jews went into these businesses because there was no existing competition there. It's brand new. Same thing in Hollywood. Jews pour into the film industry because, quite frankly, the film industry is considered to be very sketchy. A proper young woman does not stand in front of the camera and act, but a hungry immigrant woman does. A hungry immigrant kid does, because that's a way to make it. And again, you look at the movie industry, and it's Metro Goldwyn Mayer. It's one group of Jewish men after another creating a Jewish industry. and lots of Jewish movie stars, most of whom changed their names because they don't want people to know they're Jewish. And of course, the funny thing is the same with Italians, but the name changing is always so, um, so transparently, often very transparent. Dino Martini becomes Dean Martin. Like this is not this is not a big move.
This has been fascinating, and I feel like we could sit here and talk about this for quite a while longer, because I can tell this is something that you're passionate about and you know so much about it, and I think we could probably go on forever.
I'm happy to take one or two more questions if people want to stay on. I know some people have to go to work tomorrow.
Exactly. I am just going to mention in the comments just one last thing, and that you don't even necessarily need to comment on it, but I know that one of our people who's been watching and listening has mentioned, that during the Civil War, that there was one Jew, Benjamin Levy, was the first Union soldier to win the Medal of Honor in 1862. He grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle and then saved the colors from being captured in combat. So talk about a tough guy, a tough Jewish guy there.
Well,
that's a good example.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon. I mean, there are a relatively small number of Jews in the U.S. in 1861. They fight on both sides of the Civil War. There are 4 Jewish generals in the U.S. Army during the war. There are a number of colonels, including a man named Max Einstein, who organizes a regiment in Pennsylvania. And so it's Max Einstein's regiment. There's an almost entirely Jewish regiment out of Chicago. The more interesting thing is that in World War II, Jews are disproportionately in the military. That is, whatever percentage of the U.S. population Jews make up, they make a much higher percentage up of soldiers in World War II. And of course, I think it's obvious, Jews wanted to go fight against the Nazis, and so that became something that was very important to them. I had an uncle who was in North Africa and then fighting up Italy. I had another uncle who was in the Battle of the Bulge. And in fact, my 2 cousins who are watching are the children of those 2 uncles. My father was fixing planes because he was an airplane mechanic, and they didn't want to send him overseas. They needed him here. And he spent the entire war trying to get a transfer to go to Europe because this was something incredibly patriotic from a country that had given them a home. And so that's why Barney Ross would come out of retirement to go fight for the United States.
Yeah.
So we can leave it with that.
I think we can, and I want to thank you for this evening. It's been really interesting. Thanks.
And I just want to thank all the people who come from near and far. It's great to be able to do this with everybody. And if you have a very specific question, I'm happy to try to answer by email. I can be reached. It's a simple email: president@gratz.edu. And so thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for inviting Gratz tonight inside your living rooms, your offices, dining rooms, and dens. Good night, everyone.